Darius Coleman sat in seat 1A, a place of prestige, a place he had earned 1,000 times over. The cabin whispered luxury fresh linen, the soft glow of golden lights, the murmur of hushed conversations between men in tailored suits. It was supposed to be a routine flight, a few hours of comfort before landing in Geneva to close a deal worth hundreds of millions. But fate had something different planned. He had just opened his tablet, already mentally outlining the final terms of the merger, when the flight attendant approached. Her smile was tight rehearsed, not the effortless kind Darius was used to. And then came the words that shattered the calm. "We're out of your pre-ordered meal, sir." He looked up slowly. "Excuse me, the lobster bisque and filet mignon. It must not have gone through. Happens sometimes. You can choose from the regular menu." She placed a tray in front of him. A sandwich, tap water, a meal that didn't belong in first class and certainly not in front of Darius Coleman. There was no apology, no explanation, just a dismissive shrug, a practiced step backward, and she was gone before he could say another word. Darius's fingers rested against the edge of the tray. He didn't touch it. His expression remained neutral, but his mind was racing. He had flown Stratus Air for over a decade. Every flight, every reservation meticulous. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate. And the truth hit him with sharp, cold clarity. He was the only black man in first class. He looked around, 6 other passengers, all white, all dressed to impress, sipping champagne and receiving impeccable service. Their lobster bisque came with silver cutlery, their filet mignon still steaming, and him a sandwich and lukewarm water. The insult was wrapped in politeness, disguised as an error. But it wasn't an error. It was the same cold shoulder he'd felt in corporate meetings before he introduced himself. The same look of surprise when he walked into boardrooms. The same assumption that he didn't belong. But he did belong, and he wasn't about to let this slide. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "All right, let's begin." Darius didn't flinch. Not outwardly. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught him to master the art of silence, of calculated restraint. But inside something coiled, something old and familiar. This wasn't just about a meal, this was about visibility, about dignity, about the cold fact that no matter how high he climbed, someone would still try to remind him where they thought he belonged. His eyes scanned the cabin again, slower this time. The laughter of the 2 men across the aisle rang hollow in his ears. A younger attendant leaned in close to seat 1C, pouring another glass of Dom Perignon with the ease of practiced charm. They didn't look his way. None of them did, and that was the point, wasn't it? He hadn't just been overlooked, he had been erased. Darius clenched his jaw. The attendant had made a choice, a subtle one, dressed in fake professionalism and canned excuses, but a choice nonetheless. To treat him as less, to make him feel small, as if his money, his title, his presence carried less weight. He thought back to the way she said it must not have gone through. The shrug, the retreat. Not a moment spent trying to rectify the mistake. No alternative offer, no compensation. Just a cheap meal slapped onto a tray, like a reminder you're not really one of us. The signs were too sharp to ignore, and then there was the sandwich. How symbolic, how deliberate. White bread, dry meat, no garnish, a joke of a meal served with a side of indifference. Darius had faced this kind of discrimination before, but rarely in such a stark personal form. It wasn't loud or cruel, it was subtle, efficient, the kind that wounds deeper because it hides behind policies, behind excuses, behind silence. The kind that doesn't give you a headline, just humiliation. But this time, he wasn't going to sit quietly and swallow it. Not because it hurt more, but because it had become predictable. He pressed the tray aside slowly, methodically. His movements were deliberate, each one a refusal to accept invisibility. This wasn't about a lobster bisque anymore. It was about the principle. And principles, when violated, demand a response. Darius stared out the small oval window, but he wasn't looking at clouds. He was looking at history, his own. At the countless meetings where his credentials were questioned, at the elevator conversations that grew awkwardly quiet when he stepped in. At the moments where people assumed he was someone's assistant, not the founder, not the one with the final say. He had been here before. Not on a plane perhaps, but in this moment, the one where someone tried to shrink him. But the difference now, he wasn't the fresh graduate trying to prove himself. He wasn't the rising executive biting his tongue to keep the peace. He was the CEO of a company that negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He had power, real structural power, and the clarity to wield it when it mattered. And it mattered now. Because every time someone like that attendant dismissed someone like him, they were echoing centuries of assumptions. They were reinforcing that quiet, poisonous idea that black men, no matter how accomplished, don't belong in luxury. That success can be tolerated but not honored. He wouldn't accept that. Not for himself, and not for the next young black man who might one day sit in 1A expecting to be treated with the same dignity he had earned. Darius tapped his fingers against the armrest. The rhythm was steady, but his thoughts were sharp, forming like a storm front. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand the captain. That wasn't his way. He operated with precision, not fury. And right now, he was calculating. He reached for his phone, his fingers moving with purpose. His assistant Marcus Brandt would know what to do. He had built a system for situations just like this, moments that seemed small to the outside world, but carried the weight of every silent injustice people pretended not to see. Before hitting send, Darius glanced one last time at the tray on his table. Then he looked across the cabin at the polished smiles, the clinking glasses, the complete ignorance of what had just occurred. Good, he thought. Let them stay unaware. The higher the silence, the harder the fall. The message was brief, but its meaning was thunderous. Initiate internal audit protocol. Flight 917, cabin crew ID needed. Confirm when ready. Darius hit send. There was no room for ambiguity. Marcus Brandt knew exactly what those words meant, a silent trigger in a system built for moments like this. Marcus had been with him since the earliest days, back when Darius was still building his empire one brick at a time. He knew the signs, he knew the weight behind those 7 words. Back in New York, Marcus read the message and didn't waste a second. Fingers flying across the keyboard, he opened the secure database. Darius had commissioned an internal tool designed for leadership accountability across vendors, partners, and even luxury service providers. Stratus Air had been flagged in the past for minor inconsistencies, but nothing that had risen to Darius's attention. Until now. Within minutes, Marcus had the crew manifest. Faces, names, records, complaints, evaluations, and that's when the pattern emerged. The flight attendant who dismissed Darius Eloise Granger had a file that spoke volumes. Complaints buried beneath layers of HR euphemisms. Inappropriate tone, inconsistent service, guest satisfaction deviation. But some entries were more explicit, guest reports of discriminatory comments, preferential treatment based on appearance and race. One passenger had even accused her of refusing champagne to a black couple during boarding, citing policy no one else had ever heard of. Marcus flagged the entries, attached timestamps, pulled CCTV stills from previous flights, logged in the airline system. The evidence was already overwhelming. But Marcus knew his boss. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about principle. Meanwhile, back in the air, Darius remained still, calm, detached, but not idle. Every sip of champagne, poured for the other passengers, now felt like fuel. Every polite laugh shared by the cabin crew as they ignored him became an echo, a record of their own downfall being etched in real time. He didn't need to confront anyone yet. He had already set the wheels in motion. This wasn't retaliation, it was rebalancing, and by the time Flight 917 touched down in Geneva, the scale would tip, and no one on that crew would be able to claim ignorance ever again. Thousands of feet above the earth, while luxury was served on silver trays to everyone else, a quiet revolution was unfolding, not in protest, not in noise, but in precision. Marcus continued his deep dive into Eloise Granger's employment history. But he didn't stop there. He cross-referenced her interactions with passengers. The feedback logs, even internal staff communications, flagged for bias. What he uncovered was damning. Eloise's record wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom. A toxic thread woven through Stratus Air's elite service culture, one that had been tolerated for far too long under the guise of discretion. Several of her peers had similar marks notes from supervisors excusing behavior as misunderstood passengers whose complaints had been resolved without follow-up. It was all there, swept under layers of corporate polish. And that was exactly why Darius had created the audit protocol in the first place. He knew systems didn't collapse from loud failures, they eroded through silent ones. Eloise was just the face of a deeper issue. But her decision to dismiss him that day, that was the final match tossed into dry grass. Back on the flight, Darius pressed the call button. This time, a senior male flight attendant approached, older, more experienced, but with the same veneer of distance in his eyes. Darius didn't smile, he didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "Can you explain why my pre-ordered meal was unavailable?" The man hesitated. "Sir, sometimes the system," Darius interrupted. "I've flown with Stratus for 11 years. The system has never failed me." He held the attendant's gaze unblinking. "You mentioned prioritizing guests earlier." Based on what, the attendant's mouth opened, but no words came. He knew, or at least suspected, that Darius wasn't just another unhappy customer. There was weight behind the question, intent behind the silence. Darius let the pause stretch. Then he said 4 words that made the man swallow hard. "I understand. I always do." It wasn't a threat, it was a revelation. The flight was still over Europe, but the verdict had already been written. This wasn't just a meal gone wrong. This was a corporate fracture finally being forced into the light. And Darius Coleman would make sure it was seen. The plane began its descent, but for Darius, the landing had already happened hours ago when his dignity was served last and cold. Now it was about execution. As the seatbelt signs blinked on and the cabin crew shifted into their well-rehearsed routines, Darius remained still unmoved by the rituals of arrival. Eloise walked past him once more with that same hollow courtesy, unaware that her role in this flight's story was ending not with applause, but with accountability. In Geneva, a different type of welcome committee had been assembled. While Stratus's senior executives scrambled to prepare for a press conference scheduled for later that day, Marcus Brandt was speaking directly with the airline's internal audit director. The file had been sent, time-stamped, annotated, supported by patterns too sharp to dismiss. The conclusion was unavoidable: systemic bias protected by silence and shielded by hierarchy. Darius had made no public statement, he hadn't posted on social media or called the press. His was not the fury of hashtags, his was the justice of consequence. As the wheels kissed the tarmac and the aircraft slowed to a glide, the mood in the cabin remained relaxed. Champagne still lingered in crystal glasses. Laughter floated casually through the air, but Darius saw everything. 2 figures in navy suits stood near the gate, holding discreet earpieces and clipboards. HR, legal, prepared, informed. The documents had already been signed. The HR protocol was in place. Their presence wasn't ceremonial, it was surgical. The moment the crew stepped off the plane, they would not be headed home or to their next flight. They would be detained, questioned, reviewed. Their records would be frozen, their actions not just on this flight, but over the past several years placed under a microscope. And none of them saw it coming. Because that was the brilliance of Darius Coleman. He never needed to raise his voice or slam a table. His power wasn't in volume, it was in the aftermath. He had rewritten the narrative. From just another passenger to the quiet force that dismantled an entire culture of condescension. And as the seatbelt sign chimed off and the other passengers began to rise, Darius stayed seated, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. The trap had been set, and the doors were opening. As the doors opened with a hiss and a cheerful chime, the cabin crew moved instinctively. Smiles, plastered postures perfect. They had no idea their world was already unraveling. The same hands that had served flutes of champagne now nervously gripped clipboards and flight manifests, unaware they were walking straight into a reckoning. Eloise Granger was the last to disembark. Her gait was confident, maybe even smug, as if the minor incident with the ungrateful passenger had already slipped her mind. She adjusted her scarf and stepped onto the jet bridge and stopped. 2 HR officers stood in her path. Polite, calm, but firm, Ms. Granger will need a moment of your time, one said, quietly gesturing toward a nearby meeting room. Confusion flickered across her face. Then resistance. But the presence of a third officer holding an iPad with a red-lit form already loaded silenced any protest. Behind her, 2 more crew members were intercepted. Each of them led away in different directions. Their weekend plans erased their expressions, shifting from confusion to fear. Inside the terminal, Darius walked past it all with the stillness of a man who didn't need to watch the storm he had summoned. He didn't need a scene. He didn't need them to know. The video footage from the cabin had already been shared directly with Stratus's CEO. The audit report had been tagged urgent. The board of directors would be reviewing it before noon. Within hours, the news would ripple through the company: customer mistreatment, racial bias, corporate oversight failure. But none of that was Darius's concern now. He had delivered the message. Without shouting, without warning, without a single unnecessary word. He paused only once near the exit, glancing back toward the jet bridge, not with anger, but with resolution. Eloise hadn't seen it coming. None of them had. Because people like her never do. They believe in the invisibility of their offenses, small enough to excuse, subtle enough to deny. Until someone refuses to remain invisible. Until someone turns that silence into a blade. Darius exited the terminal with quiet precision. His next meeting already in mind. His posture unchanged except for one thing. He knew he'd just changed something far bigger than a flight. He'd held the system accountable. And it had finally blinked. Inside the private lounges of Geneva Airport, a quiet chaos began to unfold. While the media still slept and the executives of Stratus Air prepped their rehearsed statements for the next shareholder call, the HR teams were already knee-deep in damage control. Not because of a lawsuit, not because of a viral video, because one man had quietly exposed the rot they'd ignored for far too long. Eloise Granger sat across from a corporate investigator, her posture defensive, arms crossed. She was no longer in control, no longer the authority in the room. The investigator scrolled through the footage as Darius had submitted bodycam-style clarity from his own discreetly worn recording device, audio sharp and undeniable. Her voice, her shrug, her words. "I'm sorry, sir. We're out of the luxury meal options. You'll have to choose from the regular selection. No eye contact, no apology. A tray tossed down like an afterthought. And just a few rows away, her bright, attentive smile as she poured caviar and champagne for the other guests. The contrast was brutal, unjustifiable. And that was just the beginning. Marcus's audit had uncovered supporting documentation from 6 prior flights, incidents of inconsistency, guests with similar skin tones receiving noticeably different service, recorded complaints, internal memos advising discretion in handling sensitive clients' language that to any seasoned reader translated to keep them quiet. But Darius Coleman had never been someone who played quietly. He played smart. He had weaponized observation. He had converted silence into action. And now what had once been dismissed as minor was being treated like the systemic infection it was. By the time the second crew member was escorted in for questioning, it was clear this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a culture, a hierarchy built not just on service but on assumptions. And it was crumbling. Executives at Stratus began issuing internal memos within the hour. Words like unacceptable, under review, and zero tolerance were passed around like candy, suddenly fashionable now that consequences had a face. But Darius didn't need their apologies. He didn't need to hear their justifications. He'd already gotten what he came for: accountability. The quiet kind. The permanent kind. And the moment Eloise Granger realized her badge no longer scanned at the security gate, her hands shaking, her voice barely above a whisper, that's when the weight of her choices finally settled in. Eloise didn't cry. Not at first. She stood there, frozen, her ID badge blinking red again and again, a mechanical denial that somehow felt more final than any words. The gate agent offered a rehearsed apology, already briefed on what was happening. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You've been flagged for administrative hold. Please remain in the staff area until someone from HR arrives." The walls of her world, once built on hierarchy and selective smiles, now closed in. This wasn't how people like her were supposed to be held accountable. She had always known how to walk the line, to phrase her words just right, to be dismissive without being overt. But she had underestimated one thing: Darius Coleman wasn't the type of man who needed confrontation to win. He needed only the truth, and the truth, once visible, did the rest. Elsewhere in the terminal, 3 more crew members sat in silence, each facing their own investigations. Records of favoritism, patterns of complaints, vague but damning feedback from diverse passengers over the years. Stratus Air had no choice but to act, not just because of Darius's influence, but because ignoring it now would be an admission of complicity. And Darius, he was already gone. No press conference, no dramatic confrontation, just a text from Marcus confirming HR team engaged. Internal disciplinary review initiated. External audit begins Monday. Darius had once read that power was loud. He had learned otherwise. True power was silent. It moved like wind felt but unseen, and it left permanent change in its wake. As he sat in the back seat of a black Mercedes headed toward Geneva's business district, he looked out the window, not with triumph, but clarity. This was never about revenge. It was about making a system reckon with the quiet, corrosive ways it failed the very people it pretended to serve. And most importantly, it was about ensuring that no other black man, no matter his suit, no matter his title, would have to silently endure what he did in Seat 1A. Let them remember this moment. Let it echo. Not because he spoke it out loud, but because he never had to. Stratus Air's leadership convened an emergency meeting just hours after Flight 917 landed. There were no press leaks yet, but inside the executive suite tension hung thick. They had seen the footage, read the audit, reviewed the names, the timestamps, the faces. It was undeniable now. They hadn't just failed one customer, they had failed a principal. But what stunned them most wasn't the discrimination itself, it was who had exposed it. Darius Coleman, a name they knew from headlines, not complaints. A CEO who was used to operating in the world of mergers and acquisitions, not customer service disputes. The fact that he had chosen this hill to stand on forced them to understand one thing. Respect was no longer optional. Darius's message wasn't framed in outrage. It wasn't a campaign. It was a correction, and one delivered with such surgical force that the company had no choice but to change. Immediately, Stratus suspended the entire cabin crew of Flight 917. Internal policies were updated. Diversity training that had once been a line item in the budget became mandatory and immersive. Supervisors were rotated. A public statement was drafted, one that would later go viral, not because of its elegance, but because of its admission. We got it wrong, and we're changing. But Darius didn't wait around to watch them fix it. He had already moved on. At his conference in Geneva, he delivered the keynote as scheduled. Not a single mention of the flight, not a hint of what had happened. But those who looked closely saw the subtle weight behind his words, the sharper conviction innate in his tone when he spoke of integrity systems and the cost of silence. And that's where the story truly landed, not on a runway, but in the hearts of every executive, every service professional, every young entrepreneur who would later hear the story and understand your silence doesn't protect you, but your voice, especially when delivered with clarity and purpose, can change everything. Stratus Air had lost more than a customer that day. They lost the illusion that the old ways could stay hidden. And somewhere in a first-class lounge in another city, a black man ordered his meal with quiet confidence, knowing that someone before him had made room, not with noise, but with resolve. So what do we take from this? That sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't come with shouting or spectacle. They come in silence, in one raised eyebrow, in one cold tray pushed aside, in a decision made not to let it go, not this time. Darius Coleman didn't set out to make headlines. He didn't need to. His actions weren't fueled by vengeance, but by clarity, the kind that only comes when you've seen the same pattern one time too many. A pattern of being told in subtle ways that you don't quite belong, that your money is accepted, but your presence is tolerated. That ends when someone chooses not to let it pass, not to swallow the insult, not to explain away the cold shoulder. Darius didn't deliver justice with noise, he delivered it with precision. And in doing so, he reminded every person watching, especially those who've ever felt unseen, that your worth is not up for negotiation. That respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you enforce. So if you've ever been told to lower your voice, to not make a scene, to let it go just this once, remember Seat 1A. Remember that real change often begins not with fury, but with a firm refusal to be made small. If this story resonated with you, share it. Tell someone. Let the world know that we're done accepting the unacceptable. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Join us as we keep sharing stories that cut deep, heal wounds, and demand better. Because silence is no longer an option. We are real-life stories new, and this is just the beginning.